All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you in my co-capacities as director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, which is co-sponsoring this event, and co-director, co-academic director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, which is putting on this event today. We are extremely happy to have all of you here with us today, and we have an incredible panel as well. So I'm really looking forward to the presentations today. So here's the background on this. Since Russia's attempt to interfere with the 2016 elections, the political and scholarly communities have focused considerable attention on foreign influence in American politics. Researchers and media have investigated the scale and impact of Russia's campaign, and US lawmakers are now increasingly concerned about national security risks surrounding China's ownership of TikTok. Today, we want to think about what do we know about foreign influence in 2016 and how do we expect it to shift in the coming years. We have a great set of panelists here today. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by Renée DiResta, who's the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, Kathleen Jamieson, who is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication and director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and of Jen Pan, who is a professor of communication at Stanford University. I'm going to kick this off because the impetus behind our webinar for today and putting this event together today was because about a couple months ago at the Center for Social Media and Politics, we published a new paper on exposure to the Russian Internet Research Agency foreign influence campaign on Twitter in the 2016 US election and its relationship to attitudes and voting behavior. That was definitely a title that went through many rounds of revision and journal editors weighing in and reviewers as well. So that's where we ended up with the title. Here was the motivation for the paper that we published. When we started writing this paper, which was admittedly a while ago now, this is where the state of the literature was on the IRA trolls on Twitter in the 2016 US election. There had been a ton of really interesting work that had been done, some by Darren Linville and Patrick Warren and Clemson, by Kate Starbird's lab at the University of Washington. We had done some stuff here at the Center for Social Media and Politics, looking at the content that was being produced by these Russian IRA trolls. And a lot of kind of interesting ways of going about doing this. There was a focus on the text of tweets. There was a focus on bios of these trolls. There was a focus on the networks the trolls were meshing themselves in. There was a lot of evidence about left-wing trolls, right-wing trolls. There was debate about whether this was balanced. To be clear, no one said that trolls were helping the left and right equally. But after all this information about what these troll networks were doing, we were at the time lacking information on exposure to these troll networks and the impact of these troll networks. And then a few years ago, a paper came out by Chris Bale, Sunshine Hilligus, and colleagues at Duke and University of North Carolina, I think it was definitely Duke, and where they had a survey that was in the field in October of 2017, some panel data where they were able to look, because of this survey that was in the field that was linked to Twitter accounts, they were able to look at exposure to trolls in October of 2017. That then, on the result of that panel, we realized that at CSMAP, we were sitting on the exact same data in the exact same setup, but over the course of the 2016 election. So we had something called the CSMAP election panel that was in the field in 2016. We had surveyed people in April of 2016 and October of 2016, and we also had their vote choice post-election. And for 1,500 people in this study, we had their Twitter handles. And during the course of the study, what we did was we looked and found every single person that everyone in our study was following on Twitter, and we collected all the tweets from every single person they were following. Now, this was 2016, so this was before For You, before you could open up your Twitter feed and only see Elon Musk tweets. This was back in the day of reverse chronological feed. So what we realized at this point in time was that we had the universe of tweets to which our panelists could have been exposed. And when Twitter had released its list of the tweets by the Russian IRA trolls, we could actually cross-list those. And our data, therefore, had exposure and attitudes that we had asked people about in April of 2016 and then in October 2016, and vote preferences that we had asked them about at the beginning of the election and the end of the election. So we were able to mesh these two together. And what did we end up finding? The first thing we found was that exposure to these trolls was in tweets by these controls. And I'm going to say exposures for the rest of the talk here. What we mean is potential exposures, tweets that could have appeared in people's feeds because they were shared by people, accounts people were following in our study, was enormously concentrated. So to the point that 1% of our respondents, so like 15 people, accounted for almost more than 70% of these potential exposures. 10% of our sample accounted for basically all of them. So that's the first thing. It was enormously concentrated. The second, because we had this full 1.2 billion tweets of what people could have been exposed to in our panel, we could compare the trolls from these tweets from these Russian trolls with tweets from other potential sources where people might be getting information about elections. And here, we're not even talking about friends and family here, but if you just look at politicians or you look at news media, you see that there's just orders of magnitude more information that people are getting exposed to about the election from the news media, 4 times as much from the politicians, even despite the fact on top of all this concentration. The third thing we found, because we had this survey data, we knew the covariates of the people in our study, we also found that the people who were getting this high degree of exposure to these trolls were overwhelmingly strong Republicans, and male for that matter too. So these were sort of strong Republicans. So then with this in hand, that this was heavily concentrated in a small portion of the sample, that the people who were getting exposed were people who were likely to vote for Trump anyway, and that there was tons of other information about the election, much more about information about the election from other sources on Twitter alone, to say nothing of what people were getting from news media, what they were getting on TV, what they were getting on other social media platforms. The big takeaway was we found that there was almost no relationship between changing your opinions on issues or in terms of who you had expressed an interest in voting for as a function of having been exposed to these trolls. So we published this paper in early January. What we know now is, as I just mentioned, there was non-trivial exposure to these trolls, but it was heavily concentrated among those most likely to support Trump. There was orders of magnitude more exposure to media and politicians. And then, not surprisingly, no systematic relationship to issue polarization, no systematic relationship to vote choice. For those who want to check out the paper, you can find it here. Now, what I want to be really super clear about, because there was a lot of discussion about this paper when it came out on Twitter, of all places, but other places online, is that I want to be clear about the caveats. And so this is part of why we want to have this panel, is that we've released this paper into the world, but we want to be contributing to this larger conversation about foreign influence. So our paper says nothing about trolls, even on other social media platforms, and we know they were on Facebook. It says nothing about the Russian ads that were purchased on Facebook. It says nothing about the hacking and leaking that has been detailed by Kathleen Jamieson, and which we'll hear more about today, I hope. And it pains me to say this, that I have to say this, but this was one interpretation that came out afterwards. I want to be very clear. Our paper does not show that Russian foreign interference in the campaign was a hoax. Indeed, our entire paper is predicated on the fact that there was Russian interference in the campaign in the form of these tweets that was released by Twitter. But that's a whole other story for another day, and we can talk more about that. But we want to be super clear about those caveats. Okay, so then with that in mind, I'd like to take this as a sort of launching ground and thank all of you for coming here today. We're happy to share the results of this paper with you, but want to turn it over now to our panel to start to begin to fill out and bring forward a bit this discussion of foreign influence attempts online. And so I'm going to turn it first over to Kathleen Jamieson, following up on that last point here, where we had talked about the sort of, one of the big caveats we have is not talking about hacking and leaking. Kathleen is an expert on this topic, has written a book on it, and I'm going to turn it over for her comments. We'll then hear from Renee, and then Jen, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And we're using the webinar format. I think most people are hopefully familiar with this by this point in time. But the way to ask questions is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. The nice thing about the Q&A button, you can ask them at any time you like. So if someone's speaking and something comes up and you want to jot down a question at that point in time. But I'm going to give all of our panelists a chance to present some remarks, and then we'll turn to questions. So Kathleen, take it away. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for your important paper. I want to broaden the perspective on Russian intervention just for a moment to say that we've got trolls. They're active during the campaign period and the run-up to the campaign. We've got hackers who largely create their effect through releases by Julian Assange. We've got the possibility of fabricated content influencing decisions of James Comey that then influenced the election. We've got infiltration into the election infrastructure. We don't know the extent or the effect because we simply didn't have the structures in place to know it. And we've got troll lurkers who are sitting in local media waiting to carry out a narrative assuming Hillary Clinton wins the election. So at the minimum, we've got 5 different things that you're going to tie to Russians in 2016. Now, of those, the case for the hackers creating an influence is the most interesting to have to make, because you've got to say, did they change the media agenda? If they changed the media agenda, did the media agenda affect votes? You've got to go through a series of what ifs in order to get to a plausible effect. The argument I make in cyber war is that the release of the hacked content changed the media agenda. Theoretical presupposition, we know that media agendas affect audiences. It changed it markedly. We know that when you get significant changes in the media agenda, you get those effects ramped up to a level that is detectable. They're not terribly significant, but to be detectable. So first place it changed the agenda, the Access Hollywood tape is released. The Russian material is dropped that same weekend. And as a result, you've got 2 items in the news agenda, not 1, instead of just Access Hollywood tape. You've got the second, did Hillary Clinton's email disclosure, did the content from the indicate that she was hypocritical, that she'd said one thing in public and another in private? In particular, did she say things in closed door speeches, largely to quote unquote Wall Street individuals, that would suggest that her campaign was a big lie, that she was fundamentally hypocritical? You can demonstrate from the media agenda that it did change. Then secondly, did the narrative that surrounded that for the next month, because you're now in the first week in October, alter the media agenda in ways that coincide with changes in perspective, in perceptions marked in polls of Hillary Clinton? The answer I argue in the book is yes. Third, did they change the agenda of large exposure media events? Yes. You have a question asked in each of the 2 subsequent presidential debates that presupposes that she is hypocritical in her presentation of self. Donald Trump capitalizes on both of those when they were raised by the moderators. When the moderators raise them, the moderators are not critical. They assume the legitimacy of the disclosures by the hacked content. And that creates a disadvantage to Hillary Clinton. So the question is, can you make a hacking case? I argue that in a very close election, yes, you can. If you can change on the margin by 1% across the population, you can change the battleground states. And as a result, you can change the outcome of the election. That's the hacking case. But I want to make a different kind of argument now about successive impacts of the fact of those interventions. I want to argue first that in 2020, when the Hunter Biden laptop comes into media, that background of Russian intervention in 2016 is front of mind to platforms. It's front of mind to media outlets. And as a result, their framing and understanding of a laptop, chain of custody, open questions that contains emailed content in it is framed by their concerns raised by their inadequate responses to hacked content and inadequate responses to Russian interventions in 2016, where the media were largely unself-conscious and unaware of what they were doing in their changing of the media agenda and had not covered the trolls at all. And as a result, one downstream effect of Russian intervention was that the Hunter Biden laptop did not get the kind of coverage that it would have gotten had it occurred in the absence of the 2016 context. The second argument I want to make is that the secretaries of state across the United States became extremely vigilant about protecting election infrastructure. And as a result of all of those protections put in place, made it more likely that when Donald Trump made the case in court that the election had been stolen, evidence was available to clearly document, convincingly document that was an unfounded allegation. In other words, I would make the argument that the downstream effect of the Russian intervention was to help elect Donald Trump in 2016 and to hurt his prospects in 2020 to get the Hunter Biden laptop case trafficked into the media structures. And secondly, minimize the likelihood that he could make the case after the fact that the election had been stolen from him, which we know it wasn't, because that infrastructure was protected in a way that it wouldn't have been in 2016.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Renee?
I have some slides that I will share. They are not very attractive, but let's go with it. Sorry, this is the part where it hides the thing where you turn the slides on. 1 second. Oh boy. Okay. Come on. All right.
We've got you. We see the PowerPoint. So if you just
I
go-
know, I was just trying to, I couldn't get to the slideshow menu, it was obscured. Okay, there we go. Now I have the full screen. Sorry. So my name is Renée DiResta. I'm the research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. I'm going to talk at a little bit of a meta level because one of the things that we do at SIO is we look at IO writ large. I personally worked on both the Russian data set that was turned over to CISI, so I am happy in comments to talk about actually the Facebook and YouTube component of that influence operation that intersects with your paper, Josh. But in this particular section, what I want to talk about is how we think about full spectrum influence operations based on observation of, at this point, many dozens, I would say probably upwards of 70 data sets related to takedowns in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Venezuela, with a large focus on Russia and China because those do tend to occur, and also one operation from the US DoD. So one of the things that I want to broach immediately is that we tend to think about broadcast and social media as separate, and this is not the case. So in the broadcast media ecosystem, you have a number of different types of content. And state media in particular, a lot of the broadcast media presence developed by state actors over the years now additionally has a social media component. So there is, so the broadcast channels have social media as a channel, meaning, for example, CGTN or other RT, Sputnik, you name it, they all have presences on social media. So we have this interesting intersection between broadcast and social media. And as that infrastructure has kind of congealed into one environment, we should be treating it much more holistically than we currently are. So we have some of the social media presence of the broadcast channels have remarkably large audiences. So for example, CGTN has upwards of 100 million followers on its Facebook page. Again, saying that it has many followers doesn't necessarily translate to significant engagement or influence on that channel. But as far as the way that state actors have recognized that this is a holistic environment, it does mean that when we assess information operations, we do have to be cognizant of how that dynamic has shifted. So one of the things that we see is there are different strategies deployed in each. The broadcast media propaganda strategy is much more akin to the sort of narrative strategies that we've seen run for decades. Meaning you might use fake journalists, you might use front media, you might use content farms, you might use things that obscure the ownership structure or who runs the media outlet. But then the strategies are very much narrative driven. So perhaps reporting on a news event in a particularly inflected way. And so that is a strategy that you would have seen again in the Cold War, narratives being laundered through media properties and front media properties to reach the public by way of that ecosystem. Social media affords state actors a new set of capabilities, which are they can make virtual agents of influence. And so they run a different strategy. So an agent of influence in the kind of traditional sense of the term is an entity where the person controlling the entity is unknown. So it looks like perhaps an academic, but is secretly funded by a state actor. On social media, what you see is the ease of creation of persona types that look just like the communities that they're trying to target. So this does not look like a kind of top-down communication from media the way broadcast media propaganda looks. It's much more akin to you're speaking to a peer, you're hearing from a peer. This is very interesting in light of many decades old research in the communications field on things like the idea of opinion leaders or trusted messengers. So social media all of a sudden affords state actor adversaries the capacity to speak to people in a very different way that is 1 degree closer and more personal than the broadcast narrative propaganda strategies of old. So I am so sorry, this is the world's ugliest chart, but we have a paper currently in review on this. Dr. Josh Goldstein from CSET is my co-author. And so what we posited is a sort of way of looking at the media environment in which we have kind of a 2x2. We ask, is this broadcast or social? Well-resourced state actors have the capacity for both. And is this overt to covert? There's a spectrum there. It's not a binary. Gray propaganda is, is part of that phenomenon. But in the interest of simplification, we have this environment where you have 4 quadrants, you have different capacities in each, you have different ways that the public will respond to messages within each. And this is what we tend to see from well-resourced state actors. In addition to capacity development in all 4 quadrants, Overt social is where you see, for example, state media pages. Covert social would be where you see the troll accounts. What we see is a blending of leveraging of these strategies across quadrants to create a much more holistic information environment in which all of the capacity at their disposal is used for the purpose of advancing particular narratives or particular ways of messages that they want to get out to the public, sometimes for persuasion, sometimes for distraction. So talking about two strategies that bridge some of these quadrants, what we see, for example, is state actors that will create content on their overt assets and then amplify it using their covert assets on social media. So you'll see covert bot networks spreading overt created news articles. You'll see overt personas, for example, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a number of these sort of wolf warrior figures who are then in turn boosted by covert accounts to increase their amplification. So again, ways in which the state actors are not focusing solely in on one capacity area, they're thinking about the entirety of it. And another example of this would be what we call deceptive sourcing, in which overt state media properties leverage their own covert sources. An example of this is Yevgeny Prigozhin, for example, owns many different assorted types of properties of all kinds. RA Fan, for example, one of his news sites, regularly uses embedded quotes by purported man on the street perspectives to support the point that the overt attributed entity wishes to make. Sputnik does this as well. We see Sputnik embedding, even as far back as 2015, 2016, content from internet research agency trolls that are advancing a particular point of view. So again, we see somebody on Twitter is saying, turns out they own the Twitter account as well, embedded in a news article. And so they'll take a comment from the Washington Post, a Washington Post article on a topic, and they'll say, some people on the internet are saying, they'll embed it in their own article, but they control both accounts. So the kind of key takeaway is that covert social is only part of the story. And when we evaluate impact or influence strategy, if we focus exclusively on the one quadrant, we risk either under or over assessing impact that does not consider the full scope of the operation. And then the final point I'll make, again, I am apologies for my hideous eye chart here. Just 2 days ago or last week sometime, Meta put out their adversarial threat report in February of 2023, right? And there's a section on it that I would encourage anyone to read, and it's on Russian influence operations related to Ukraine. And what is very, very interesting about it is one of the things that we posit is that when you have these four quadrants and capacity in each, there's a regulatory arbitrage dynamic that happens for the state actor in the sense that if one of the entities, one of the four quadrants is compromised in some way, such as it becomes harder to run covert social troll accounts because they're constantly getting taken down by the platforms, you see them roll and reprioritize their attention to other quadrants that are less likely to be moderated. And what you see in Facebook's adversarial threat report is an illustration of exactly this happening. In this particular case, not only is Facebook going after the covert social troll accounts on its platform, but they have also significantly throttled the reach of the state media accounts on their platform. And so what you see, what we see as outsiders is we see a lot of that content and strategy rolling to Telegram and the unmoderated platform, so unmoderated social, while at the same time, Facebook notes ways in which they appear to be trying to create new domains and trying to reapportion their sort of covert broadcast activities elsewhere. So this is you have to be thinking at a systems level across broadcast and social and the integration of the two when you're assessing propaganda from a well-resourced state actor. And I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Renee. And again, just a reminder to our audience, feel free to leave questions in the Q&A at any time if you're interested. And I'm going to turn it over to our final panelist, Jennifer Pan.
Awesome. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk about influence between Russia and China. So we tend to focus here in the US on foreign influence to the US, and that's rightly so. But because of that focus, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that there are lots of diverse targets of influence. And Renee, at the beginning of her, what she was sharing, mentioned a lot of other countries that are being targeted by influence by Russia and China. Here, I just want to share a little bit of new work we're doing on how the Russian government is seeking to influence the Chinese public. And the place we're going to start looking at this is the war in Ukraine. So at the onset of the conflict, and even now, Russia has a strong strategic interest in not only using state media to gain the sympathies of the domestic Russian audience, but also to try gain sympathy among foreign publics. My research group has been working to collect Chinese social media data in real time across different platforms, Chinese social media platforms. And when the Ukraine war broke out last year, we were able to capture ongoing real-time collection of posts from Weibo about the conflict. We have about 500,000 posts. So what I'm going to share with you today is just about 500,000 posts from February to April of 2022. These are made by a little over 160,000 accounts. I'm sure many people here are familiar with Weibo, but just to make sure we're on the same page, Weibo is China's largest microblogging social network. It's most similar to Twitter. It has about 500 million monthly active users. So the data we collected is pre-censored, it's pre-censorship. And using these data, what we're trying to do is measure narratives related to the Ukraine war. And specifically, we're interested in understanding whether Chinese social media users were adopting narratives aligned with those that we saw in Western and US media, or those put out by the Russian regime. So what we do is classify discussions of the Ukraine war into one of two meta-narratives. The first meta-narrative is this Putin as aggressor narrative. This is the idea that Putin's expansionist ambitions drove Russia to invade Ukraine. And then the second narrative is what we call the Putin as victim narrative. So this centers on the idea that Putin is defending Russian sovereignty against Ukrainian aggression, which is fundamentally spurred on by the United States and NATO. So these two meta-narratives include completely different understandings of the intent and the goals of actors, as well as differences in the emphasis, framing, and interpretation of all the events that are happening. The Putin as victim narrative was heavily promoted in Russian state-controlled media. In the US and Western Europe, we regard the Putin as victim narrative primarily as disinformation. I'm going to show you, these are two quotes that have been translated from Weibo. The first is falling into the Putin as aggressor narrative. This is saying Ukraine will expel Russian invaders. And the second, in the Putin as victim narrative, this is saying that the conflict is fundamentally caused by here, United Kingdom and United States. So what we do is sampled thousands of posts from our 500,000 set, and we hand-coded them to put them into the narratives, and then we fine-tuned a pre-trained Chinese BERT model to classify all of the posts. And what we find is that actually most discussions, about 75%, most discussions of the Ukraine war on Chinese social media do not fall into either of those narratives. So most people are just like, what's going on, sharing facts, expressing sympathy for the Ukrainian people. But then of the posts that fall into the two narratives, relatively more are associated with this Putin as victim narrative, which is in the green line in this plot. And that's about 20% of all of the posts. And then about 6% fell into the Putin as aggressor narrative. And that's in the red here. And so just one thing to note, the time trend patterns between the two are similar to each other and to the overall rise and fall of posts about Ukraine. So what this is showing is that Russia's narrative of the conflict was more prevalent on Chinese social media than the narrative of the war we have here in the West. But for the most part, the majority of posts did not adopt this Russia as victim narrative. Okay, then the next question is, who was promoting Russia's narrative on Chinese social media? And if we think back to last year, there was a perception that it was Chinese state media that was promoting Russia's narrative. So Chinese state media outlets like the Global Times did echo Russia's kind of this Putin as victim narrative. But when we look systematically at what types of accounts were echoing the narrative, we actually see that the majority of this narrative came from accounts without verifications. About 55% of the Putin as victim narrative posts came from accounts that were not verified. The next largest share came from accounts of verified users, state media accounted for 7% of posts espousing this narrative, and then government accounts even less at 4%. And so what this means is that at the onset of the war, Chinese state media was not the one primarily pushing this Putin as victim narrative. And you can see actually Chinese state media also put out posts that have the Putin as aggressor narrative. The one thing to note here is that we have no idea what the real identity of those users without verification are. So we don't know if there's actually a Chinese person behind the account. We don't know what the sourcing of that is. What we see, though, is that these unverified accounts are citing Russian sources when they echo the Putin as victim narrative. The Russian embassy, RT, Sputnik are very active on Chinese social media, and they are not banned like many Western social media accounts are on Chinese social media. And we also see many, many accounts like these two that identify as Chinese users who are continually making posts containing this pro-Russian narratives. The first here is an account, actually I took these screenshots last night. They've been continually posting for the last year. This post here is an account of Ukrainian soldiers helping Russian soldiers. And then the second here is documenting Russian victories in Ukraine. Okay, so I'll stop there, but just to sum up, the thing I wanted to emphasize is this fact that we do see evidence of Russia working to influence the Chinese public. We can see that because they're overtly doing so through their embassy and media accounts. We don't know what they're doing covertly. And I would say, still know just very little, relatively speaking, about the ways in which Russia is trying to exert its influence in China and potentially vice versa.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Thanks, everybody, for kicking off this interesting discussion. All right. So again, audience, feel free to put things in the Q&A. I think there's a lot of interesting directions we can take this in now. I'm going to start with a question that we have from a graduate student who's studying the history, characteristics, and impacts of the American Twitter enclave, hashtag Catholic Twitter, whose name, Dominique Sanfilippo, who's written in, who wants to know a question, and I assume this is more for Kathleen and Renee, but the extent to which, although Jen, feel free to jump in as well, about the extent to which foreign actors understand the nuances of American politics. So this is, I think it's sort of like, we're getting multiple questions that are kind of like, where are we now in 2023? So, there's some early examples of this kind of meddling online where, the dialect is off, the grammar is off and everything like that. But then we also have these papers like Kate Starbird's work out of University of Washington showing this kind of sophistication of the Russian trolls kind of inserting themselves into particular networks in the US. Renee, your work as well in dealing with all this. So where do we think we are at this point in terms of this? Are adversaries investing in kind of detailed, localized knowledge to be able to jump into things like hashtag Catholic Twitter that are sort of more, that may be serious pressure points in American society, but are not sort of like surface area known topics that you would need a bit of expertise. So what I guess in some ways it's like, what's the level of sophistication that we should be thinking about for some of these foreign influence attempts now?
I love the question. Can I go?
Yeah. Jump in.
Okay. So one of the really unfortunate ways in which the data set for the 2015 to 2018 the Internet Research Agency operation, the Facebook and Instagram data was never made public. There's a variety of reasons for that we can talk about after, but it really changes the understanding of the operation. Twitter is so reactive. It is about jumping in, participating in the conversation in that moment that is trending at that time, which is why you see, for example, papers that have come out about Russian trolls participating in the vaccine conversation. None of that stuff appears in the Facebook data. And the reason for that is that they are engaging very, very differently on Facebook because they actually have an incredibly sophisticated, quite granular understanding of American society that really comes through in the Facebook data. They were not particularly adept at differentiating between Catholic versus evangelical American culture. They create Army of Jesus, and they create that very early on, actually. So there's a recognition. They actually evolve a Kermit the Frog meme page into a Simpsons meme page into Army of Jesus. That is how the progression of that Instagram account happens. And they're doing that because they're recognizing that they're not getting audience growth and traction with certain types of content, but then they really nail it with Army of Jesus. And that's where you start to see Jesus with the MAGA hat on as the operation progresses. One of the areas where you see the granularity best of all is actually in the content targeting the Black community. And we detail this in what is a non-peer-reviewed paper because, again, the data set limitations are significant, but it's called The Tactics and Tropes of the Internet Research Agency. It was the paper we wrote for CISI. And what you see in there is an understanding, you see them really delve into, there's a Black Baptist page, there is a Black Hebrew Israelite set of content. There is such an understanding of the scope of the Black American experience that there's like 36 or so, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, different types of pages related to that community. That community by far experienced the most sophisticated and granular targeting. And one of the ways that they did that was they actually did send people to the United States, this is under the kind of Project Locta indictments, you can read about this, in which you see them doing ethnographic research into the American cultural experience. So from Russia, we see that incredible understanding of sophistication and nuance. We do not see that, however, from China in any of the influence operations we've seen in English language originating from or linked to Chinese state actors. There's actually quite a glaring difference in sophistication and understanding that we see from that particular actor versus Russia.
Kathleen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there's a probable reason that they're so much more dexterous in that space. The Russians back to the 1950s had been exploiting racial inequities in the United States for propagandistic purposes. And so the historical knowledge of how this country can be torn apart on that issue is deeper than it is on some of the other polarized facets on which they try to capitalize in the 2016 election. But their real genius on the front that is of most interest to me is their selection of Julian Assange in order to drop the hacked content throughout the election. First, they needed an intermediary. They couldn't do it credibly. They picked him to say, hello, this is Boris, New York Times. I'd like you to cover things was not going to work. But Julian Assange had credibility with the major media outlets because he'd partnered with them substantially on many earlier instances in which important content was put into mainstream media in order to hold various governments accountable. And it was Julian Assange who figured out when to drop the content. He also figured out that the way he would sustain the hacked content narrative was to ensure that he's dropping new content every week. He dropped content every week up to the election. He also moved the most controversial content first when it was needed most. It was needed when Access Hollywood tape was about to dominate the news agenda that Sunday morning on the eve of a presidential debate. And the dexterity that he showed is not necessarily Russian dexterity. Their intelligence was in selecting him and ensuring that whatever they did on the backside, ensuring that he would in fact have access to everything they had. And then they were also assuming that the US media trusted him enough that the fact that he was the source would not become the story. So if it hadn't been someone the media had partnered with before, they wouldn't have been as likely as media reporters to obscure the identity of those who gave him the content. But because he had been trusted as a vehicle for trafficking out legitimate content in the past, that narrative is suppressed effectively. So they made one really smart move in hacking, and that was they found Julian Assange. He did the rest.
I just want to say something on,
Yeah,
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
On China's lack of sophistication in this area, which is what everyone has observed. The thing to keep in mind, however, is that it's not clear that the US, influencing the US, is a strategic priority for the Chinese government. So I think that's also something very important to keep in mind. Yes, there might be a difference in capability, but there also might be differences in strategy and in prioritization.
Jen, actually, that rolls really nicely into another question we got in the comments from, I'm going to butcher this, Akin Unver is the name, at least is the name here, which said, thank you so much for this great panel. The question is, do you see a pattern of increase in the likelihood of either Russian or Chinese meddling attempts resulting in information suppression? So Jen, you said here that you don't think necessarily that the Chinese goal is to influence discussion in the United States. Is the goal here to suppress conversation elsewhere? Do you want to maybe say a little bit more about that, or perhaps a little bit about your prior work on cheerleading and these kind of different strategies that could be employed here? But this question of, we often think of foreign influence as trying to inject information into the conversation. We've written about this, you've written about this, Molly's written about this, but this alternative, which is to try to shut down particular conversations. So do you see more of this happening?
Right. So I would say it doesn't look as if the United States is a strategic priority for China when it comes to influence. It could also be that they have weak capabilities. So that's both on the persuasion as well as on the distraction side. But elsewhere, Southeast Asia, domestically in China, we absolutely see the Chinese government actually using both strategies, both trying to persuade as well as trying to use bursts of content coordinated at a certain point in time to redirect attention. So both strategies are something that we have seen. And the thing to keep in mind is that different from the era where we just had broadcast media, with digital media, so much of what is happening is competition for people's attention. And so by redirecting people's attention, you can, in fact, be suppressing information. So you can achieve the outcomes of censorship, not by deleting anything, but by redirecting and reshifting what people are paying attention to, so that the most relevant thing is buried and difficult for people to find. And just I reiterate, for China, we do see both strategies at work domestically and in other parts of the world.
And Josh, that redirection is actually what's behind the hacking release strategy. It is deflect attention from vulnerabilities of Donald Trump, particularly with the Access Hollywood tape. And I should note that I put additional data into CyberWar's second edition to document the Assange phenomenon, and also to indicate the extent to which agenda framing occurred around the release times.
Renee, did you want to jump in on that as well, or?
No, I think the one piece I would say, we published a paper on this in Harvard Misinfo Review during COVID. Actually, early on, you do start to see, you can look at the Facebook ad buys of the state media outlets. And that's one other way of assessing, is this narrative intended for a domestic US audience? You know, it may be in English, but this is a universal language, if you will. And so you can look at where the ad targeting is going to get a sense that no, actually, in fact, they're really targeting other publics, but with English language content.
And one of the things the ad targeting tells you, by the way, is they were smart enough to know where the susceptible voters were, whom they needed to activate to vote for Donald Trump. So what the ad buys tell you is there was enough sophistication in the Russian troll operation to have identified actual susceptibilities that would, if activated, advantage Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton.
Okay, great. We're getting lots of questions in the Q&A, which is awesome from the audience. We're also getting methodology questions, so I may go to some of those at some point, but I'm going to go from Matt DiVerna, who used to work with us here at CSMAP, who's now a PhD student at University of Indiana, has a question for Renee, and this is going to bring it back to the 2023 aspect of it. He says, I saw your team's report forecasting the potential misuse of large language models. So 12:45, we haven't hit TikTok or GPT chat yet. So if you had the over under on that, it was 12:45. But yeah, so large language models. Could you talk a bit about the report and highlight what you're most worried about? But also conversely, are there ways that we could be using large language models in ways that to try to combat misinformation, either, I guess, for detection purposes or for counter strategies? Have you guys thought about that at all? But if you could share a little bit of that report with us, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's up on io.stanford.edu. I think it's still the top thing on our blog, and we did it in conjunction with OpenAI and CSET, again, Josh Goldstein, who is my co-author on the paper that I was talking about today. So for several years now, I think, since ChatGPT has really evidenced to the public the phenomenal potential of the technology, but researchers have had access to GPT-3 for several years. And we've written quite a bit about what it does that's very interesting from just speaking purely in the realm of influence operations detection. There are a couple of ways in which people will commonly find IO. In the 2015-2016 timeframe, it was copy pasta type text. The bots were not very sophisticated. You could identify networks looking at that kind of copy pasta phenomenon. That does, however, become something that just becomes almost sort of like an online meme. And so now it returns a lot of false positives, because you will see legitimate activist groups that will use that same strategy just to try to game trending topics. There's always an adversarial kind of cat and mouse game that happens. One of the things that we see in the Internet Research Agency data, particularly again in the Facebook data, and this is where my kind of ongoing frustration is related to the data set differentials here, is that early on, there are very clear tells. The articles are incorrect. It's obvious this is a non-native speaker. They don't use the in the way that a native English speaker would. There are keyboard, they're using a backtick instead of an apostrophe. There's a lot of different ways in which you can assess that this is not necessarily what it seems to be. Beyond that, there's also what we call the kind of what we at SIO call the sort of uncanny valley of content, where they're just not quite getting it. The meme is not quite right. They try to use African-American vernacular English. They don't quite nail it, and you see actually there was a lot of Black women activists at the time saying these are not real people who are talking to us and trying, kind of co-opting our language patterns. And again, it's just a little bit off. What you do get with GPT-3 or ChatGPT or any other democratized access to large language models, even just access to large language models within a country's intelligence infrastructure, people that would normally run these operations, is it eliminates the plagiarism tell. Another way that a lot of the GRU's operations around Syria were found were because they used plagiarism. They would take 3/4 of an article that somebody else had written, and then their fake journalist would stick a couple sentences in that would inflect it towards a Kremlin point of view, and then they would go submit it as contributed content. Eventually, editors actually found that this was plagiarized content. What large language models do in this particular capacity, access will reduce costs and increase the number of actors who can participate. So it becomes very easy to test messages very quickly. You don't need armies of fluent native English speakers or whatever language it is that you're trying to target to produce the content. So the content creation process is made more efficient. You can fine tune a model around persuasive type language as well. And you can, again, begin to incorporate different styles of persuasion. You can speak quite authentically to a community because you can write a manifesto in the style of a sovereign citizen versus a QAnon fan. There's a real significant differentiation that becomes possible. And so it impacts both content creation and actor types quite significantly. And that's what we go into in the paper. As far as the second part of the question on detection, I think right now we've just been considering mitigation from the standpoint of a kill chain model that we articulate in the paper around which stages of manipulation have potential interventions. But I think that ultimately a lot of it comes down to rethinking either authenticity on social platforms or just media literacy to help people understand where the world is going and that what they see on the internet is going to be, kind of significant portions of it will be unreality at some point.
Jen, we got a question from Tamar Metz, which I'm going to try to combine a little bit as well with a question earlier from Michael Tang, which is, Tamar writes, China's a unique case for understanding full spectrum propaganda because the state has influence over content moderation of social media platforms. Could we see the lack of censorship on Russian accounts on Chinese social media as an indirect endorsement of Russian propaganda, or even as evidence of collaboration in the information space between the two countries? And the earlier question we got, which may go beyond this, is just, we talk about these foreign influence attempts as foreign influence operations as having a source country and a target country, but is that getting not sophisticated enough? Might we be thinking about seeing multiple countries combining? Do we have any evidence of that? Maybe Renee, you want to speak to that? Or is that something we should be thinking of these larger things? But Jen, on the China and the Russia, do we think this is like overt collaboration, tacit endorsement, coincidence?
It could be any or all of those things. And the problem, and I think there was a later question of how do you study influence in countries that are closed? Right. So when the target of influence is authoritarian regime that imposes information control, then it becomes very difficult to ascertain what is going on. It could absolutely be the case that there was coordination between Russia and China. I mean, if you look at the timing of the invasion, it was conveniently right after the end of the Beijing Olympics. So there could be. On the other hand, we're currently in a world where Russia and China seem to be coming closer together. But I just want to remind everyone that if we look historically, USSR, Russia, China have at times been in conflict. And so it's not the case that it's inevitable that Russia and China become allies. And in fact, if we look back several decades to US foreign policy explicitly tried to make sure that USSR and China were not allies. That seems to have, we've passed that phase, but the answer is that Russia and China could be collaborating. There could be tacit, the lack of censorship could be because the Chinese government is endorsing it. And by having these unverified accounts put out content rather than Chinese state media, it gives Chinese government an out because it's not explicitly endorsing Russia's stance. Or it could be that China had limited information and it was also caught off guard to a certain extent. The thing I didn't talk about in this study is that actually over the past year, if we look at censorship on Chinese social media, the most censored topic is actually the Ukraine war. So there is censorship happening. We would have to, we're continuing doing more analysis on who exactly is being censored. One thing I also want to remind everyone is that in March or April, right after the Ukraine war broke out, Chinese social media discussions were kind of proliferating. And then Chinese social media platforms implemented Real ID displays so that no matter what your security settings were, everyone's location was revealed. And what we see after that happens is a rapid decline in all discussions around the conflict. So there is absolutely censorship happening in China around Ukraine, but we just don't know, unfortunately, the details of the relationship between Russia and China.
All right, I want to switch to Kathleen. There's a question in here from an anonymous attendee of the panel, but that is something I've wondered a lot about, which is, my take on it, my question would be, does the foreign influence, once it first sort of enters the vernacular in 2016, become a bit of a red herring in the sense that it's something that is politically easy to go after, but maybe being overshadowed by covert influence attempts at the domestic level? So the question here is, Kathleen, I don't know if you want to speak to this, about how do we have a sense of since 2016, the volume of these kind of influence operations were between domestic level influence operation attempts versus foreign information? Are we spending too much effort on foreign? Is it now that the cat's out of the bag, these kind of covert influence operation attempts globally, the ones we need to be worrying more about are from domestic actors in countries globally and in the United States? Or are we still correct to sort of be focusing in on these foreign attempts because they're somehow sort of categorically different? So take that in any direction you'd like.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you mean by domestic. So if what you're talking about is what's the relative threat of domestic extremism compared to a foreign influence that's going to come through informational channels, obviously domestic extremism has got to be prioritized. But the other thing that I think is important to ask, as when I was asking the question, is what are the ways in which we put systemic protections in place that actually address both? So to the extent that we understand what is going on inside our systems and are able to identify content that is problematic, we don't have to draw a boundary line at the border in order to say this is or is not something that we ought to be dealing with. And so I think that thinking about this structurally, since the platforms don't have global boundaries for any practical purpose, and instead thinking about all those factors that could be problematic in our system, regardless of origin, is probably a more productive way to address the question. But the literal answer to the question is no, I do not know the answer to what is the relative amount in relationship to.
All right, so I want to thank everybody who's asked questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, this has been people were really responsive, and we're not going to have time to get to all of them. But I am going to, before we close out, I'm going to go to one topic that is getting a lot of discussion in the news, and I would like to give everybody a chance to respond to this, which is whether TikTok. So a couple of different ways to think about this, right? Like just the straight up question: what are your senses of sake on the future of TikTok going forward in the United States? What do you think would be the consequences if this bill that we're now seeing the Republicans advance, banning TikTok use in the United States, was advanced? Do we think that TikTok is, within the context of this discussion today, our seminar here today about foreign influence, is this the ultimate example of foreign influence, you know, to get a country to adopt an entire platform that you're able to siphon information out of and surreptitiously control? Or is it a total red herring, right? That this is an economic dispute that is getting, you know, caught up and is distracting from the much larger question of the way that these, like, you know, as Renée was saying, these sort of multidimensional aspects of these through state media, through all sorts of different platforms, like, where is TikTok in this discussion here today? And I want to give each of our panelists a chance to answer that question, and then we'll close out. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay, thanks, Jen.
ByteDance, I think we need to keep in mind that ByteDance is also an actor in this, and ByteDance does not want to be a tool of the Chinese government. It has worked very hard to separate Douyin, which is the platform that's available in China, from TikTok. However, that's not to say that ByteDance can push back against all CCP attempts to influence it. So I think the thing to note in Chinese politics is that we think of the Chinese government as a consolidated entity, but it is not. The Chinese Communist Party is formed of elites, agencies that have conflict with each other, who have different goals, and we don't know exactly how that will play out in this case. So with ByteDance, there could be some Chinese officials who want TikTok data for strategic purposes. There could be also Chinese officials who absolutely do not want that because they want ByteDance to be able to grow economically and to help China's tech sector. So I think at the end of the day, it's this balance between potentially differing incentives and goals that Chinese elites have. We know that ByteDance would not like to be banned, for TikTok to be banned from the US. So I think we should also keep in mind that it is an actor with power and with incentive of its own.
Yeah, I would say, just to add a little bit, we have seen adversarial actors. I think the Jordanian Air Force comes to mind, leveraging TikTok to, you know, again, try to put out content. Wagner Group recruitment videos are on there. They're quite interesting. They're a whole cluster of activity. The platform does have interesting moderation policies. It is somewhat opaque. They're you know, currently there's a lot of conversation between researchers and TikTok at the moment around what a researcher API would look like. That would give us better visibility into the dynamics of the platform. So much of what happens, though, is the For You page. And so there's a lot of challenges with understanding. A lot of the reach of the content on TikTok does not come through the simple follower relationship, as is more common on Facebook and Twitter, but instead it is what is pushed out through For You page. And we do have now, as of the last 2 months, evidence that TikTok employees can decide to, quote unquote, heat content. Again, this is the media reporting on the topic from internal TikTok documents. They seem to have confirmed this. So there is some interesting dynamics with regard to the power of the employees at the company to serve as curators of content pushed out through the For You page.
Kathleen, you want the final word on TikTok?
I have nothing important to add.
Okay, well, stay tuned, because I'm sure there's going to be so much more on this. And please, once again, on behalf of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, it's been my absolute pleasure to welcome Kathleen, Renée, and Jen here today for this discussion. I hope you all have found it as exciting and interesting and stimulating as I have. And thanks to everybody for joining us here again. And, you know, keep looking forward you can go to both the websites, the Center for Social Media and Politics and the Jordan Center, to get all of our programming coming in the future, and at the Center for Social Media and Politics as well, all of our research in these areas. So thank you guys so much for being here today. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks all of you for joining us today. So take care. Bye-bye, everyone.